Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation.
Welcome back, everyone, to Madness and Grace podcast. We're excited that you're here with us today to talk about rebuilding lost hope. I think it's a really interesting topic. I've got several points to make as we jump into this. But Matt, I wanted to ask you, if someone said to you, again, I think this is a term that we use all the time, like I'm losing hope, or you just need to have hope. How would you define hope? What does hope mean for you?
Well, number one, I would say hope is not just sadness, because I think that's what a lot of people think. Like
hope is sadness?
No, lost hope is not just sadness. Okay, so I think that a lot of times people think if a person doesn't have any hope, they're just sad. It's more than that. So I think it really is I think lost hope is a belief that things can't get better. And I think hope is kind of a confident expectation that things can change. And, I think those are the two sides. Lost hope is things can I really deeply believe they'll never get better. I see no opportunity for these to ever get better, regardless of what you tell me. And then hope itself is just a real confident expectation, whatever that might be connected to. I think from a biblical perspective, you would base that on God's promises and his faithfulness. But I guess what the Hebrews says, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So this idea that you believe that things that haven't occurred can occur, will occur. That would be hope. But I do see a lot of times people say, well, someone says they're hopeless, that just means they're sad. And it's so much more than that.
Well, you hear hopelessness as one of the symptoms on a checklist for depression.
Right. And it can be. Absolutely.
It is. And you can feel hopeless and not have depression. There's lots of instances in life where people can feel hopeless. I think we all know someone in our life who is just ever the optimist, and doesn't seem to ever struggle with hopelessness, and is just always able to be grateful and look at the best parts of life and has that positive attitude. And that's a wonderful place to be. And not all of us are like that, right? So if you're listening to this and you're going, yeah, I know someone like that, and maybe you strive to be that person, or you don't understand how they're there, I think it's important as we start talking about hope to realize that if you're experiencing hopelessness, whether it's a symptom of your mental health or it's circumstantial, it's not a weakness of your faith. It's not a weakness of personality, right? It's
right.
Something that you're going through. And good news is there's ways to work towards rebuilding hope.
I think you made a good point there. I mean, it could be externally driven. You could be you and I went through Harvey here in the Houston area, and our houses flooded and all of that. It was horrible. And I knew plenty of people were like, oh, I'll never rebuild. This will never be better. I'm going to lose. I'm done. It can be biochemically driven. You could have depression. You could have other mental health problems that cause you to literally generate negative thoughts and feelings and lose hope. Or it could be a product of your environment, not just from a circumstantial, but the way you're raised, the way you deal with stress, the way you do. So it's not as easy as just like, well, why are you hopeless? You got everything to live for, that
right.
kind of. So, I think there's when someone comes to you and they say they're hopeless, or someone comes to you and demonstrates that, you have no idea why they're hopeless.
Right. And I think when we talk about hopelessness, we're typically talking about like periods of hopelessness. When it becomes problematic, when it becomes a challenge, a struggle, a difficulty, you've got days, weeks of feeling hopeless. But hopelessness can pop its head up anytime. There are days where, so here I talk about my Ph.D. again, my process of getting that. I sat in front of the computer and felt on certain days, I am absolutely getting this done. I know I can do it. I have the hope and faith that I can move through this. And other days, I'd lay on the floor and be like, this is hopeless. I'm never going to get this done. And I truly felt like, I can't do all of this. And it just jumps around, right? So, you can have one day where you're feeling very hopeless and a situation pops up and you start having thoughts of hopelessness, and you might rebound from that quicker, just depending on what's going on. So it's not necessarily always, and I'm jumping into a bunch of stuff, but if you're someone who has periods, like short bouts of hopelessness, you're able to kind of pull yourself out of that and get back to the feeling hopeful and thinking hopefully, you've probably developed some skill, whether it was taught to you by your environment or in therapy or a friends group or your faith community, on ways to identify what's going on within you and say, okay, I'm actually going to, in this real quick, short moment, rebuild some hope because I'm feeling hopeless and I need to do some things, use my skill.
And that's the ability to be resilient in the face of that. So, and it's important for people to have those skills. A lot of times people don't have those skills, or a lot of times the events around them, the circumstances, or their brain overwhelms those skills, and then they're, so really, I like the point you make. Hopelessness can be brief, even momentary, but we're talking from a pathological kind of nature of hopelessness. It would just be something chronic, where I know that even on scales that we use here, one of the hopelessness items is like, how much did you feel hopeless over the last 30 days? So it gets this idea of kind of a chronic kind of thing. I think another thing I would say, you asked me about, kind of defining hope and hopelessness. Hope is not just a feeling. It's it's different than just a feeling. Anxiety, I think, is probably it's a good sense. I mean, both you feel that physically and mentally, but it's a feeling.
Kind of prompting in a way.
Hope and hopeless. Hope is not just a feeling, because, so I know I wrote down, knowing that we were going to talk about this, there's a psychologist, Charles Snyder. He has some theories on hopelessness, and he defines hope as having three components to it. And so goals, like clear desires or outcomes for the future, pathways, strategies, or plans to get there, and then agency, which is the belief that the actions you take will actually influence change. So in that, you see this kind of connection between kind of this change-oriented kind of thoughts as well as actions to move that forward. And when I see people that are hopeless, they're immobilized. They have no ability to move forward. They are trapped in this hopeless pit. There is no future, so there's no reason to try to get to the future. And so I think one of the things is hope is there's an action-oriented component to hope, in the sense that you may not have a plan to get to the future, but at least you believe there is a future that there's a possibility of having.
Yeah, people who are experiencing hopelessness, I mean, I hear this all the time. It's, they go, well, why would I even do that? Someone makes a suggestion for them to do something to help their situation. They go, why would I even do that? It doesn't matter. It's gonna fail catastrophically anyway. So I'm just not going to do anything. And so that hopelessness kind of immobilizes them, where hope mobilizes us.
Right. No, absolutely. For mental health conditions, there's a lot of them out there. Obviously, major depressive disorder. That's one where hopelessness is a very common symptom. PTSD can have hopeless components. Just grief, people dealing with grief or complex grief, they obviously see hope. And depending on how long something like that continues will depend on if it becomes something that's kind of pathological. I think more importantly, hopelessness is very much a predictive factor for suicide. In fact, almost all the suicide models that exist, it's not about being sad. It's about being hopeless and having no possibility for a future. And so you see that quite a bit, the idea that hopelessness is a kind of a predictive factor for that.
Yeah, we see it a lot in our DBT program.
Well, what's DBT?
Dialectic behavioral therapy. Our DBT is a program developed for people who are struggling with borderline personality disorder. And I think we have a podcast episode in the past you can go back and listen to. It talks about what borderline personality disorder is. But there's a hopelessness that shows up in that one as well. And really kind of working with these individuals to understand reality in the context of what hope is and how to develop that. One of the things that we talk about is rejecting reality. So let me back up a little bit. Talking about rebuilding hope. So you're feeling hopeless. It's not that you just say, okay, I'm hopeful now. I'm going to feel it. I'm going to make this decision. And now I feel hopeful again. One of the first things you have to do is identify the struggle. Like, what is it in life that is creating this hopelessness? If it's your mental health, that it could just be the mental health, not just be,
right.
Or it could be situational, right? So if it's situational or mental health or the combination of the both, you have to be able to identify what that is and then accept that as the reality. As much as you may not want that to be your reality, accepting this is what's going on. I'm going through a divorce. I am not happy with this. This is not what I want my reality to be. And I accept that that's reality. When we reject reality, the pain becomes like unbearable. It's unbearable pain. And when we work towards accepting reality, not saying this is what I want, but accepting that this is what is happening, pain becomes bearable. And in that bearable pain, we can start to implement skills and things that we want, that we can use to help rebuild slowly our hope towards the future and what the future could hold that we are eager for.
I think that's a good example that you just gave there, which is very circumstantial or situational with the divorce. I think a lot of times people become hopeless because they recognize that the future that they had planned for is not ever going to happen. So in that instance, you had always planned to be married and with this person and raising your children with them and at this standard of living and doing this and whatever, all the different specifics of that. But now that's just absolutely not going to happen. So instead of, well, there's no future for me. Well, no, that future isn't.
Right. And I'm going, no, you could still get married and have kids.
Right. That future that isn't
with
for
that
you,
person.
But helping that person, that's rebuilding hope, helping that person recognize that there is a multiplicity of futures that would be wonderful. But that future, we have to let go of that. Yes, that's not going to happen, but that doesn't mean you have no future. And so, yes, you could be remarried, you could be all types of things could occur. And so that is definitely one aspect of rebuilding a person's hope. I think another thing that people don't like to listen, particularly to uncomfortable things. So I think one of the things that can be very helpful for somebody who's really struggling with this is just listening to them, just letting them talk and not correcting them. Letting a loved one or a ministry staff person, letting them talk about the sadness they're feeling, the hopelessness they're feeling, the darkness they're feeling. And then, as we've talked about in here before, the idea of relationship, then just kind of adding in little reminders of past positive things or God's faithfulness, or not in a fix-it kind of way, but letting them, all those thoughts are in there. They want to express them. They want to talk about them. But if they're uncomfortable for you to listen to, a lot of times what you want to do is go, okay, there's no reason for you to be, here's the deal, here's the 3 things you need to do. Everything should be good now. I think a lot of times you just have to kind of walk along with people as they're working these things out.
And those conversations, if done well with compassion and love, right, as the focus, they help people to, when I talk about it from a DBT perspective, accept reality. But you're also working towards kind of understanding and developing meaning in the situation. From a different take, if the situation is that you have just been given a diagnosis that you don't like, learning to accept the reality of what that is and find meaning in it. And the meaning isn't like, oh, well, everything's going to be so much better now that you have this diagnosis, because that may not be the case. But what is that meaning for you? And understanding what does this mean for your life? What does this mean, positive and negative, not to be overly optimistic? Because, once I have a quote here from Viktor Frankl, and if anyone is familiar with him, he's got a great book, Man's Search for Meaning. He's several wonderful books. But suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. And that's not to say the suffering goes away completely, right? But when we take control of our life, even if it's just in a cognitive way, the meaning is really understanding of the situation. And having that understanding helps us realize that we can find hope in a future that maybe wasn't what we were anticipating or wasn't right in front of us. And understanding how to kind of grow your mind space to see a new possible future helps with developing that hope.
Rigidity is often bad, and flexibility is better. And so we all vary on that factor. And so, when people have negative circumstances or traumatic events or a struggle with a mental health issue, the more rigid they are, a lot of times it's very difficult for them to kind of, move, be malleable in that situation. One of the things I love about working at the Hope and Healing Center is that we do use a faith-based approach to care and integrate faith into all of our treatments and trainings and things we do here. And, one of the things I've said a lot of times for people of faith, people in Christianity, is that for the Christian, hope is more than a feeling. Well, a lot of times people just think about hope as a feeling, but, hope is a person. Hope is Jesus. And so the fact is that, God transcends our circumstances. So things can look really bleak for us, but we've been promised a better future than where we are, a better future than where we are at any point in our life. And that's a promise that we can hold on to. And so a lot of times in the context of rebuilding hope, particularly in a faith context, is to remind people of the promises of God. Not that, oh, well, now I have a bunch of promises, so I feel better, but promises that say, okay, I know that right now when you look forward, you can't see a better future or changes, but here are the promises of God, and the reality is that we can trust that God is being honest with us, that He's truthful, that He's faithful. So we may not feel it, but there is, and I think in the context of say Snyder, the stuff I mentioned earlier, is this starts to build up that idea of, goals or pathways, for instance, towards the future. So, I think that, you really just have to give a person, I guess motivational interviewing is all about this, but you really just have to give the person some foundation that they can stake the idea on, that there's a possibility that this could change. This could be different than it is right now. Because, I don't know, would you agree with that? Isn't that the first step towards what you would think of as hope?
Yeah, I think there's two components to hope. That what you just said, external, right? But then there's the internal component of it, which is, what am I going to do to continue towards that external hopefulness, right? Because if I just say, okay, there's something in the future possibly that I might be happy about, okay.
And believe that. You really
believe it. Yeah. But to just one day flip a switch and believe and have hope, it doesn't always happen, especially if you're... So what are the workings that you're going to be doing to actively keep your hope? I think is something that is important in that as well.
No, absolutely. I wrote down a few, kind of suggestions for individuals that are either family members or ministers that might be working, or lay counselors, kind of hope builders. I think, one would be, and again, none of these are like a magic bullet, like you do this and it's all going to go away kind of thing. So these are just some suggestions, just some things that you can do. Frankly, I think the best thing to do at the beginning is just to listen. Just let the person tell you how they're feeling. How are you feeling? And how is this impacting you? I think one would be spiritual disciplines. I think things like scripture meditation, not getting in some big, deep Bible study, but just giving them some particular scriptures, particularly about the character of God, that they might meditate on. I think prayer is always an important thing. I think a lot of times for people that are hopeless, they oftentimes don't feel like they're worthy to pray or can pray. You might just pray for them, with them present out loud. I think that's a way for you to kind of bring them before God, that they can begin to start to make those steps. I think, as I said, listening, but within a spiritual context, that might be lamenting, kind of a lament of, how bad things are, kind of thing. And that's all throughout the scriptures. I mean, there's nothing negative about that. I think helping people make cognitive shifts, where it goes from, you watch for things like all or none thinking, like X happens, so that means the entire world is going to fall apart now because of that. But just trying to give them little links to kind of get away from those ways of thinking. And again, maybe giving them some thoughts on how things might change in the future. Not how everything is fixed, but small things, because it starts with small steps. And then I think finally, maybe just giving them a doable action per day, something that they can do and be successful with, which can be very simple. Maybe tomorrow you get up and get ready and do X, and then affirming them for that. Look, even today was a better day than yesterday because you were able to do this. And so, and then of course, celebrate any progress.
Small progress too. One of the things that
very small.
Maybe getting up and getting out of bed, putting clothes on, and then going to the couch for the rest of the day.
That's enough. I took a
people
shower
would say,
today.
Oh, yeah, a lot of people would say, no, that's not enough. You just moved from the bed to the couch. Well, I haven't moved from the bed in 2 weeks. Right. So, small progress.
Any momentum, I think, is always to be celebrated and really is a positive sign. And that's how we think about it, here in the mental health world. We see a client that's just not making progress. I mean, when they show up for their appointment and they actually have taken a shower and they got themselves together and they have proper hygiene, and I mean, that can be a big deal if they've never done that before. So it seems so small and simplistic, but sometimes that's where it starts. You don't usually see some giant leap from, the pit of hopelessness to everything's awesome today. I just kind of woke up and had a good night's sleep. So no, I say all the time, when you're thinking about mental health issues, and hopelessness is certainly a mental health issue, you got to think in months, years. Don't think in days and weeks. I mean, this can take a long time to walk out of these things. And you really need somebody to help guide you, be that a professional or certainly supportive friends, family, and people within the faith community.
Yeah. And one of the things that I said earlier, if you're struggling with a bout of hopelessness or depression or whatever, it's situational, and you may think that you're the only person that's experienced this or that you're weak for having this hopelessness. And that's just not true. Everyone experiences it. It's an emotion. It's something that is a common experience to being human. And some people experience it at different levels than others. And others have developed or been taught, like I said, ways to navigate when the feeling of hopelessness starts to arise, or they have developed a process to maintain their hopefulness. And you're not abnormal for feeling hopeless. It's common.
Not at all. I mean, read the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. I mean, he is very hopeless. There's, David's in the Psalms. I mean, there's lament and hopelessness all throughout the scriptures. So we certainly know that it occurred in ancient times, and we see it all the time here around us. I do think we need to be, we need to always be careful that we don't assume that the feelings we have are the same as other people have. So like the saddest you ever were may pale in comparison to what real hopelessness looked like. So, just going, I was like that, and then I just read through the Psalms and everything was great, So I think you have to be real careful because experiences are so individualized and they can be so different. We don't want to just assume that we can make that one-to-one connection. I think a supportive church, for instance, doesn't pretend that a person's pain doesn't exist. I think they recognize that person is in great psychological pain, that they really are in a dark place, and that they're willing to walk along with them in that valley. They're not just dismissive of that. And so I think, that's what a supportive friend looks like. That's what a supportive church looks like. I think you're willing to be there and walk along, even when it's very uncomfortable, and recognize that it could take a while, and it can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
when you're dealing with someone who's experiencing some extreme hopelessness, they're going to say the same things over and over again. They're going to have the same complaints, comments, and you might be thinking, you said this, why haven't you done anything to address it? Or, and that may be your thought. And so someone who is compassionate and understanding is going to think that maybe, and also still be there for that person with boundaries, right? You don't have to be
Right.
answering the call every time they're calling, but yeah, it can be
No,
extremely
absolutely.
frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not and again, you gotta let yourself off the hook. It's not your responsibility to fix somebody. And
Right.
so, your responsibility is to be supportive. Your responsibility, I believe, is to give them direction towards a professional care if they need that. But your job is not to fix them. You can't fix them. No one individual is going to be able. It takes a team. One thing I would say about when you're listening to someone who's hopeless and they're kind of lamenting or expressing these feelings they're having, which I think is very therapeutic in its own right. I think sometimes it's useful for you to ask kind of forward-facing questions if you can, and like kind of scenarios. What I like one thing I'll ask is I'll say, if things were better, I know that you believe they can't get better, but let's just imagine for a moment that they were better. What would be different? Name one thing that would be different if things were better. And usually they could come up with one thing. And a lot of times, again, what you're doing is you're just building this idea that at some point you're hoping for a connection for them to say, oh, well, if things were better than X. And then they kind of have this kind of moment where they go, oh, well, X isn't that big a deal. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's not like they're not going to just jump out of it, right? Believe me, the first time you ask a question, they're going to say, oh, well, then everything in the world will be perfect. And no, one little thing. There is a reasoning aspect to this where you're trying to walk them through it. It just depends on how cognitively impaired they are by what they're dealing with. But you're not a professional. You're just trying to walk them through and give them some guidance towards a different way of thinking.
Yeah, from a professional perspective, I mean, that's the magic wand question, right? Like, if you can wave a magic wand and things were different, what would be different,
Right.
And
one
people
little thing, just one little thing.
They're going to be able to tell you that because they may not think they can get there, but they would tell you what would be different because they know what they want and what's not happening. And so it's very, very, very easy to kind of say, like, yes, this is what would be happening.
But there are people that can't even tell you that. And they can't tell you anything. They can't even think of anything being different. And that clearly is a sign of a much deeper hopelessness.
They have no concept.
Come up with even the smallest thing.
Right. Yeah. Oftentimes we use that in treatment as a way to identify goals, kind of set up a treatment plan, right? 'Cause you say, here are the problems that are happening in life. Now, we call it in some ways life worth living. What was your life worth living? What would that look like? Okay, and now what's getting in the way of what's going on now to what we want, which is our life worth living goal, and that's how we. Just for all you people out there wondering how therapy works, that's sometimes how we start to work on things. What's getting in the way of your life worth living, and let's talk about that.
Right.
And what do you have control over in that? Setting up some goals and working towards that.
Yeah, I don't think people, I mean, it's just something you and I, in the field would just take for granted. But I don't think people realize that if somebody is hopeless and they are engaging you in conversation about that, or about how horrible things are, or about how they feel, that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that they've crossed a line. They're trying to reach out. They're trying to connect. Now, they don't recognize it that way, but that's totally different than, well, their wife calls you and says all he does is lay in the dark bedroom with the lights, obviously the lights are off and he's in the bed and he never gets out of the bed. He has lost his job now. He never gets up, and then when you try to engage him, no, I don't want to talk about it. I mean, so if they're willing to talk to you, I find that to be tremendously positive.
That's
so
hopeful for me if someone's willing to talk
for
about
the person.
it. Yeah.
But I think for laymen who don't hear these deeply dark thoughts all the time, it can become very difficult to listen to.
Overwhelming.
And that's when you get into these kind of like, well, you have so much to be hopeful for. You have so much to be thankful for. If you really trusted God, you would know. I mean, you get into
All
these
you
kind
do
of,
is complain. All
right.
you do is
So,
complain, and it's
so again, that's when you got to, in your mind, you've got to step back and you have to say, even though this person has explained to me maybe why they think they feel the way they do, you don't know that that's why they feel. I mean, they literally could have an endogenous depression that's biochemically driven. They could have been traumatized at some point in their life, and now that's manifesting itself. I mean, there's so much that could be going on. You don't really know why this is going on. Now, it's going to be important to try to figure that out, not for you necessarily, but for a professional. You're a support person. That's what you're offering. You're not Mr. Fix-It. You're supporting them. You're part of a healing community that's going to rally around them, hopefully, and help them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are all some great points. I think as we wrap up today, when we talk about hope and hopelessness, like I said at the beginning, remembering that if you're feeling hopeless, or if you're working with someone who's feeling hopeless, approaching it with compassion and love is really the best way. We talk about being a listening ear, develop that relationship, be a part of their community that's supporting them, and work to get them connected with someone who's a professional. Because while hopelessness can show up in a variety of different ways, it can lead to suicide. I mean, people who are feeling hopeless, they talk about suicide. Right?
Absolutely.
I do want to, before we wrap up, I want to dispel a myth. A lot of people think that if you ask someone if they're thinking of killing themselves, or if they're thinking of committing suicide, that's going to put the idea in their head, right? No, they weren't thinking about it, but now they are. And that's just absolutely not true. If you ask someone and they're thinking about it, they're likely going to answer yes. Most people don't lie about it. They'll give you an honest truth, or they'll say, I don't know. And that's definitely a sign that you need to get them to see a professional much quicker if they're saying yes or that they don't know, right? So any other thoughts before we wrap up today?
Well, I think, there's no better place for a person to rebuild their hope than within a faith community. I think we just have to kind of humble ourselves and step back and say, I'm willing to walk along with you through this dark pit that you're in. I can't fix you, but I can be here with you, help kind of shoulder the burden. We both have a hope that transcends those circumstances, and that's a hope in Jesus Christ.
Well said. Thank y'all for being here with us today, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.